Good afternoon or good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We have a very, very special guest here today. He is an award-winning journalist, author and broadcaster. He's written 9 books, including The Abolition of Britain, The Cameron Delusion, The Rage Against God, and most recently The Phoney Victory, The World War II Illusion. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the illustrious, the revered, and in his own words, the hated Peter Hitchens. How are you, sir? Thank you so much for joining us.
So far, it's a pleasure.
Thank you. This was really very, very exciting, so thank you for joining us.
Don't get carried away.
Don't get carried away. Well, I actually wanted to start on something that's just been in the news. I wanted to know what you thought about it. On Question Time recently with Mr. Lawrence Fox, there was a bit of a dispute over, I don't want to get into the Harry and Meghan thing, but just on the question of, is Britain a racist country? It's quite an interesting one because it drives everyone's passion so high.
Obviously, there are. I still use the term racialist because it was, as it were, what I was brought up on when I was a 60s left-winger, and it seems to me to be a better word. There is still a fair amount of racialism in Britain.
Yeah.
And I think if anybody who is black or not white in this country experiences it in some way or another, it'd be ridiculous to pretend there wasn't any. I would say there's a lot less than there was. I would say that the relations between people of different skin colours in this country are better than in most parts of the world. Certainly a lot better than they are in the United States, where there's a huge amount of unacknowledged, hidden segregation, not enforced by law, oddly enough, but enforced to some extent by money and to some extent by a sort of invisible force, which, for instance, divides Washington, D.C., the capital of the country, straight up 15th Street, all the way north, between white and black, and then beyond that, going on into the state of Maryland, where Montgomery County to the west tends to be pretty white, and Prince George's County to the east tends to be pretty black. They're pretty prosperous. It's where I lived in Bethesda, Maryland in the 1990s. I think the only black person for miles around was my landlord.
Really?
So there you see a much of people. The legacy of slavery in the United States is constant and bears down upon people the whole time. It still runs very deep through that society, and when you return here after time there, you feel very strongly that awful force and oppression and resentment isn't here. To say it's a paradise of racial harmony where there's no discrimination is obviously ridiculous, but it's not by international standards, in my experience, anything like as bad as it could be, and it's a lot better than it was. Let's not be complacent, but let's also not be ridiculously overdo the extent of it.
I mean, I suppose it's interesting that you talk about the invisible force of, because it's not enforced by law, the
Absolutely
segregation.
Not. No, the law forbids it.
But I think you see
take
that,
steps to try and overcome it in hiring, for instance.
Do you think there's a sense of self-imposed segregation, and that's a bit like with multiculturalism? You get people who actually just sort of maybe it's different with America.
I wouldn't, because it's not something I've personally experienced from either side.
Sure.
I simply wouldn't want to try and speculate on it as anything other than as an observer that this thing obviously exists, and it exists in the north as well as in the south. Though in the south, of course, the history is different, and so it expresses itself in a different way. But anybody who was black in America who went north in search of an end of discrimination would be disappointed, I think.
Yeah, I agree. Well, so I think that sort of brings me on to the next point about that Lawrence Fox discussion, which is about young people and wokeness. You know, what are your thoughts on just even the poor solecism of wokeness?
I was a very left-wing person when I was young. I can't jeer at people trying to find some sort of set of opinions and rules of life which they think are morally satisfactory. Because I tried to do it myself and was very mistaken in what I did. But I would point out to anybody who does this to think it possible that they may be mistaken, that in years to come they may feel they went a bit far or they got it wrong. I would much rather people had passions, and particularly passions towards what they thought was the good, than that they were indifferent and apathetic. So I'm not against it in a sort of dismissive, grumpy old man way. I just think that there are elements of it which are dangerous. And what it particularly seems to me to tend towards, and I was like this too, is an intolerance of other people's opinions, and worse, an intolerance of those people themselves. And Roger Scruton's great distinction, which is worth remembering so soon after he died, was that when he argued with right-wing people, he thought they were wrong. When they argued with him, they thought he was bad.
Yeah.
And that is the difference. An awful lot of left-wing people think that it's bad to disagree with them, and I think wokeness does contain a big element of that. And if I've conquered anything, any of my worst tendencies from when I was younger, the one thinking that my opponents were bad is the one I think I've got over most. I try very hard to stay on reasonable terms with people I disagree with.
Being charitable.
As I say on Twitter, I have a rule of the presumption of intelligence. I'm not against ad hominem as such. It has uses, but I won't resort to it until somebody has proved beyond all reasonable doubt that they're too thick to argue. After that, I tend to think that ad hominem is quite useful. It's probably going to be more memorable than the Socratic method in that person's life. I certainly remember the moments of great humiliation and defeat in argument when I was young, which stuck with me for a long time, and there was certainly some ad hominem in that.
Are you concerned about the way young people are going politically?
No.
Really?
I don't. I can't. As I say, I can't be, because I would prefer people to think than not to think. I'm concerned about the general decay of what I now see to be the real pursuit of goodness, the real basis of morality in our society. But I understand that it having disappeared, and all kinds of things, from the general acceptance of Christianity and the general acceptance of a certain canon of literature and music and architecture as having been superior to anything else, that those things having gone, people are in a howling wilderness where they have to grab what they can. But I don't think I'm going to persuade anybody by just shouting at them, "Oh, you're idiotic and you're woke and I despise you." What would that do? I have to start from the position that they might actually eventually see what I came to see in the 60s, which is now increasingly unimaginable. There were still crumbling ruins of an older system of thought still there. They didn't defend themselves very well, and they were not, frankly, particularly articulately defended. But they were there, and I had something to kick against. What I note very much among a lot of young left wingers these days is they have to invent an enemy.
Yes.
To some extent, people like me serve a purpose, bleached survivors of a former age, who they can regard as the embodiment of evil and think of as the establishment. I'm not the establishment. I have absolutely no power and even less influence, and I'm certainly not in the mainstream of anything in government or education or anywhere. But it's nice for them to have somebody to be against, and I'm sure I serve that purpose for some people.
Do you find you come under attack a lot?
In which case, good, because at least they have something against which to test their own ideas.
But do you find you come under attack a lot? You get a lot.
It's just normal. I do what I do because I love argument, and you can't have an argument without having opponents, and opponents will sometimes be rude to you, just as I will sometimes be rude to them. So what? That's not the worry. The worry that I have is a closed society in which people decide that there is that the debate is over, and that those who have opposed the new consensus should be killed or imprisoned. And I don't think that's as far away as some people complacently assume. I think it's perfectly possible in my lifetime.
So it's almost as if to say that a divided society, divided, not overly divided, but divided where there's lots of dissent rather than a sort of blind unity, is better for a
much
society.
Much better.
Yeah.
Enormously better. It's the same. A garden without rain won't grow. A farm without rain, the crops won't grow.
Of course.
And, what we think of as bad weather is essential for the fertility of the soil. And mud is dirty, but within the soil are amazing powers which enable things to grow. And an adversarial political system, an adversarial academy, is far more likely to produce good fruit than a sterile one where nobody ever disagrees with it. But I'm hugely in favour of proper adversarial debate, and I think the adversarial political system is what keeps us free. It's the thing I always quote from Richard Neville, the founder of Oz magazine, which was in many ways the forerunner of so much modern journalism. A very left-wing person, but he said that in the 1960s, when he came over from Australia, there was an inch of difference between the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, but it is in that inch that we all live.
Yeah,
and
right.
He was quite right, and it was a profoundly clever thing to say, and showed that he'd actually given the thing some thought, which a lot of people never do. So no, adversarial is great.
So perhaps there's a when people talk about the politics of division, it's almost like politics in itself is division.
In this country, that's been, for whatever reason, I mean, I've speculated as to whether it's a hangover of the Norman and Saxon division, or whether it's a hangover of the Civil War, or both. But whatever it is, we do have this, or certainly we did until recently have this situation where there were people belonged to tribes, and those tribes actually had a lot in common, but also they had a fundamental difference which separated them, and they were represented in Parliament by two parties which sometimes genuinely hated each other.
Yeah.
And it was because they did so, and because one of those two parties was at all times ready to step in and take over the government, that we have the amount of freedom that we do. It's a good system. Most countries haven't developed it.
But I suppose
we should be more pleased that we have it than we are, and more inclined to treasure it. So whenever people say, "Oh, what we need is proportional representation," we get rid of this first past the post two-party system. Don't, whatever you do that.
Yeah.
The adversarial system, the parliament where two parties shout at each other across a space to two sword lengths, is a good thing. Because there is a conflict in society, and if Parliament doesn't reflect it and express it, then it will come out in other ways. And look at France, which explodes into violence every few years because they simply do not have a safety valve, like our adversarial Parliament.
I suppose talking about being adversarial generally in society, that is, highlights the importance of freedom of expression, which I've heard you speak about, and you very much, subscribe to the First Amendment in America, but we don't quite have that.
Well, we can't
in the
have
UK.
it because we have parliamentary supremacy, and the basis of the First Amendment, it begins with Congress shall make no law, and we can't. So we could not, with our Constitution, have that. But nonetheless, the principle which it embodies is something which everybody in politics and journalism and the academy should pursue. There simply should be no restriction on the freedom of speech. Now, of course, there's all kinds of jurisprudence about that. There's a book I always recommend called The Shadow University, which discusses the battles to preserve the First Amendment on American campuses. It's not as simple as saying you can say anything. You can't incite to violence, for instance. You absolutely can't. And there are all kinds of other things you can't do and claim freedom of speech as a protection for. And it's more complicated than it looks at first sight.
Absolutely.
Even the old statement, you're free to speak except that you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theatre. Even that has complications to it and arises from a rather awkward case. But the fact remains that the instinct of every sensible human who wants to keep the mind free should be to oppose restrictions on freedom of speech and the policing of speech at all.
The shouting fire in a crowded theatre is an interesting one, and I actually remember watching a video of your late brother Christopher Hitchens talking about it with Justice Holmes, was it?
Yeah, I think it was something to do with the Eugene Debs case, but it wasn't actually being used in the way that people now think it was being used.
I think it was something about I'm going to say Yiddish socialists in America who had propaganda leaflets against going to World War One.
It was certainly to do with the World War One.
Yes,
because people were put in prison for opposing conscription in World War One, particularly say Eugene Debs, and Holmes didn't take, I think, a particularly creditable view on that, as I remember. But don't test me too much on that because I haven't recently done my homework on it.
It's an interesting one because I suppose incitement of violence. I mean, what I want to ask you really is, do you have any quarrels with the laws that we have today in the UK about speech, like the Public Order Act and things like that?
Well, I think the Public Order Act's dangerous, particularly in the way that they're drawn.
Yes.
I think it's the 86 one was the source of a lot of difficulty and gave the police an excuse to intervene in matters of speech. There was a case I explored of a slightly nutty preacher called Harry Hammond in Bournemouth, who was making a speech saying that he disapproved of homosexuality in the middle of that town.
Sure.
And was attacked while doing so and pelted with mud. He was a frail old man. and two police officers simultaneously intervened, one on the side of Mr. Hammond and the other on the side of the mob. He was taken to court, and in the end he was the one who was prosecuted.
Really?
Basically for being pelted with mud. It's a fascinating case. It's worth looking up. Again, the details I'd have to mug up on to go into it. But I think that was a Public Order Act episode, and it went, as far as I was concerned, it went badly if you were in favour of freedom of speech.
Sure.
He wasn't inciting to violence. He wasn't making any personal criticisms. He was actually expressing an opinion, which was unpopular, but which ought to have been, in my view, heard.
It's another one that you hear a lot is incitement to hatred, which is rocky,
well,
dangerous
again,
waters.
How do you define all these things?
Yeah.
And again, the subjectivity of so much law and the subject following the Macpherson report. And there's a chapter in my book, The Abolition of Liberty, about the Macpherson report, which is one of the most fascinating and bizarre documents ever to be printed by the British government, let alone to become the basis of so much law afterwards. But what it fundamentally accepted was the idea that if anybody thought there'd been an incident of racial discrimination, then there had been one.
Yes.
It didn't need to be objectively defined. Now, once the law ceases to have objective definitions of the crimes that you can be prosecuted for committing, then actually it's lawless.
Yes.
It's the end. The whole point about law is that it states clearly what is and what is not allowed.
Yeah.
And this is unclear and subjective. The other point of law, of course, is that it limits punishment. So these acts, if you commit them, will be punished in such a way up to the limit. And if there's no upper limit to any punishment, then again you have the key to totalitarianism. Increasingly,
Of course.
we're tending in that direction as well. Certain sentences for public protection and stuff like that, which along with the abolition of the rule against double jeopardy and the abolition of the right to silence and the destruction of independent juries, which has taken place while leaving them technically in place. Terrible threats to the liberty of the subject,
of course,
which most people haven't noticed. Well, you say, of course, most people are unaware of what's happened. They simply don't know what they've lost, partly because they didn't know they ever had it.
I think I do feel like there's a growing movement that's non-partisan across left and right. It's small, but I get a sense that there's a need to reinforce the principle of free expression.
Well, they've got a lot of work to do in that.
Yes.
I don't know exactly where they're going to insert their lever into the British political system, because I don't see in our current Parliament many voices that are independent or even thoughtful on this matter. Looking at the benches of the current Parliament just fills me with a dispirited gloom, because who is there? And the other day, when I wrote my story about the censoring of the official report on the alleged use of chemical weapons in Syria,
yes,
are unfollowed by almost all major media, and I thought, well, who would there be? Once there was Tam Diel, a great independent member of Parliament. But who is there in Parliament now to whom I could turn to raise this matter? There isn't anybody I can think of at all. The unanimity, interestingly enough, on the Syrian issue in Parliament, the acceptance that it's purely a humanitarian issue, that there's nothing else going on, for instance, is total.
Yeah.
There's no dissenting voice.
Syria is something I want to get into, but if you don't mind, if we just stay a little bit on free expression,
it was just something which comes up naturally in that context.
Because when I first met you, the talk you were giving was pretty much about Syria, and a little bit on Iraq as well. There was one question. It's a really tough one, maybe not for you because obviously you're a principled man. But what do you think about Holocaust denial? And how they're, David Irving's in jail.
I don't think people should be imprisoned for it, because,
of course,
apart from anything else, that it only makes them swell with joy and persecution. I don't think if David Irving had been harmed by it, then there might have been a case for it. But I think alas, it strengthened him. No, I think it's the problem about Holocaust denial for those who do it is that that's exactly what it is. They are denying something which is recorded objective fact.
Of course. And
this is either evil or mad. But I think that people who do this can be exposed without putting them in prison. I think what happened to David Irving in the libel courts was perfectly just. And I think the Lipstadt case, pretty much put an end to that. But that's what I hugely object to is the way in which the term denial, which is perfectly properly applied to these people, is increasingly now applied as a term for people who disagree with certain, how shall I say, consensus views.
Yes.
Wrongly, and also it seems to me deliberately to smear them by equating them with David Irving.
What are your thoughts? Because I just wanted to bring it back a little bit to the wokeness and identity politics. I don't know if you approve of such a term, identity politics, but
I never really understood what it meant. People have explained it to me, but it's one of those things that drains straight out of my...
I suppose
it's where I take refuge in being a jobbing scribbler and not an intellectual. I mean, you can explain it to me and I'll probably tell you I disagree with it, but as a phrase, it doesn't stick in my mind. I could probably, oddly enough, I could probably tell you more about dialectical materialism.
Yes, that's quite funny.
Which does, alas...
Do you not consider yourself an intellectual?
No, absolutely not.
I suppose it's
no, I'm
for
not.
other people
I tried. I was asked for reminiscence about Roger Scruton by the Spectator last week, and the best I could come up with is I went in a vain attempt at self-improvement to a lecture he gave, and I couldn't understand it. And then he said at the end, of course, this I'm surprised that this idea has not had more effect or taken more root. And then he sort of shrugged and said, "But I suppose nobody understands it." And everybody in the room laughed.
Well, if you couldn't understand it,
no,
how could anyone else?
I'm not. It's not. Philosophy, as I discovered when I attempted to study at university, particularly English linguistic philosophy, which is what we seem to do a lot of, is not for me. And I love ideas, but the actual dissection of them in the way that philosophers do doesn't appeal. And I'm a scribbler. I'm a describer of things, and I quite like arguing. But the term intellectual repels me, and I reject it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's best said by other people than one.
Yeah, sure, but I will always deny.
Well, that's where we can disagree on that, I suppose. But just on that identity politics thing, I suppose. There's so many different definitions to it, but I've heard people say it's when people stress the importance of group justice and group rights over individual liberties.
Okay, right. Yeah, then I think I have an inkling. Well, I think that's a mistake, because of course the rights, if you like, or the freedoms, as I prefer. I don't think there is any such thing as a right. The freedoms of a group will inevitably conflict with the freedoms of individuals, and I'm more concerned with freedoms of individuals.
And do you think there's a
freedom is not freedom is not in itself a cause.
Yeah.
As Karl Marx said in one of his, as I say, he was a good journalist and a sharp observer of contradiction. He said that no man fights liberty; he fights most the freedom of others. Mm-hmm. Which is what you do, and people's liberties conflict. As I Berlin said, well, you that's why libertarianism is such a nonsense idea. The idea that you can base a whole system of thought and morals on liberty as such. Your liberty will, from time to time, come into conflict with the liberty of other people. What do you do then?
And it's non-substantive liberty.
It can't. It cannot form the basis of a moral system.
Yeah, I suppose that's where you get into the difference between, because this is an interesting one, and I suppose it's quite interesting for you in particular, where you have economic conservatism versus moral and social conservatism, and I believe you very much identify with moral.
Yeah, but what's called economic conservatism isn't conservative; it's liberal.
Please go into detail there, because that's an interesting one.
It's fair, isn't it? It's not conservative at all.
So you don't believe
the Thatcher Reagan era was not conservative. This is the great mistake that people make in a misunderstanding what conservatism is all about. To think that Margaret Thatcher was a conservative, or Ronald Reagan was. I think Margaret Thatcher had some conservative opinions in her personal life. She grew up in an old-fashioned way, and I find her personally much more admirable than I find her politically.
Okay. Did you ever meet her?
Yeah. I did.
Did you get on well?
It wasn't interesting. I was just a scribbler on her. Travelling around on the plane, which is the old RAF VC-10. She used to fly around to harangue world leaders, and would she take along a cargo of press. It wasn't actually a sought-after job. I was the number 3 on the Daily Express political desk at the time, but I got given the show. We sat at the back of the plane, and every so often we'd be summoned up to the presence. And I remember once we were flying to Japan. It was a long flight, and we had about the third briefing came, and she was completely and utterly uninteresting in these briefings. She said nothing indiscreet. There was no gossip or anything. She just talked to us as if we were deeply interested in, I think, Anglo-Japanese affairs or something, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
And she carried on for about 20 minutes monologue, and then she stopped. And I thought she'd finished. So we were sitting around, it was like an old-fashioned railway compartment, we were sitting around 6 seats around a table, and she was there, and I was on the corner. So I thought, well, she stopped, I'll get up and go, I can't stand much more of this. Well, but she paused for breath, and she gave me such a look, I thought my trousers were going to catch on. But no intimacy, good heavens, I wasn't one of the people who said, oh, Peter, I want to talk to you about this sort of stuff. I remember going once to the Downing Street Christmas party, and I'd been warned of this. It was quite funny when it happened. You came in, you were announced, you went up some steps, and she shook you by the hand, and then she gave you a great tug, put you past to the next person who came. There wasn't any danger of actually having a conversation. So I met her, but not as in any way as an intimate or anything like that. I don't claim to have had any but I have sat closer to her than I'm sitting to you now.
Oh, wow.
I'll tell that to my grandchildren.
So how would you define conservatism then? That's a tough one. I suppose that's...
No, not really. I think it is. It really is based very, very profoundly upon Protestant Christianity.
Sure.
On personal responsibility, on life being governed by a strong moral code, on the preservation, therefore, of all the institutions which have grown up around the church, institutions of government and law, of property and family. A reluctance, an understanding that the origin of law is very deep, and the origin of peace and of settled society in general is very deep, and therefore the meddling with things is unwise. A reluctance to change unless a very good case has been made for it.
That almost.
So I think it all comes from there, and this is why I think a society which has abandoned Protestant Christianity will find it very difficult to be conservative, because no one will see the point.
Of course. I suppose, but what you've just said there about personal responsibility, can you see how perhaps someone takes that and applies that to free market capitalism, and how, economic conservatism is very much linked to what you're saying?
Well, that's just maybe, but the thing about serious, Alan Smith, for instance, wrote about moral sentiments, I think, before he wrote about economics, and he understood that the power of the market, the invisible hand, more or less, couldn't function without the huge levels, particularly of trust, which a strong, universally accepted, voluntarily accepted moral system creates. And trust is actually what makes the most profound difference between societies which work and societies which don't. I think probably the reason why the Scandinavian city-states, which really are so successful, is because they have inherited, for whatever reason, I think partly religious, partly historical, a very high level of trust, which makes it possible for them to function as they do. But another origin of trust must, I think, come from the acceptance of a common Christian faith as well. But personal responsibility is, if for instance you were a successful capitalist, must lie, it seems to me, amongst other things, in making sure that the people who work for you and your customers are not cheated.
Yes.
I don't see much of that, frankly, in the laissez-faire explosion of the Thatcher-Reagan years.
Just a bit of a Marxist
festival of asset stripping. No, I'm a Christian. The reason why Marxism appeals is because of the elements of Christianity in it. And it is actually, to many people, it is that concern, that concern for one's fellow creatures, which appeals in socialism and in communism. And Marx was not, although he wanted to see the end of religion, he understood its appeal. The old religion is the opium of the people, is the bit everybody knows, but he went on to say it's the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world.
Yeah.
He understood why people had these sentiments. He just thought they were misdirected. I think that he was misdirected.
So do you think there's always a danger of a society that becomes, less and less religious? Is there something that's going to replace religion? And
yes, of course. I mean, but what fundamentally replaces religion is any old rubbish. A vacuum opens up into which things are sucked.
Could you say
all
Marxism?
kinds of things? I suppose Marxism, so-called, in its many forms in the 19th century, did arise as a major intellectual force at a time when literal gospel belief became impossible because of the great researches that had been going on. And I think that to some extent it did have, for many people, the force of a religious worldview. And that's why it was so potent for that period. But it did take many forms. And it didn't. Everyone's heard of Lenin. Hardly anyone's heard of Kautsky or Bernstein and the revisionists, for instance, of German social democracy, which was an entirely peaceful experiment. The great tragedy in some ways is that Bismarck managed to keep the Social Democrats from becoming the majority government of Germany. And if Germany had become a fully social democratic country before, say, about 1910, how the history of the world might have been different.
Of course.
But it was, there were many forms it took, and Lenin was, although he claimed, the word Bolshevik means majority, although he claimed to be the majority of the Russian Social Democratic Party, that was only for a brief period when he organised a putsch at the party conference. He wasn't really the majority.
Well, I suppose because you are, I suppose, a Christian social democrat.
Well, I use the term social democrat because I think it helps people to understand what my that I've got absolutely no principled opposition to, for instance, the state ownership of some industries, such as the railways. I'd renationalise the railways tomorrow.
Utilities?
Yeah, certainly water, like a shot.
Sure.
It's been extraordinarily badly managed since it was privatised, and largely from abroad, and the levels of investment in it are atrocious as we see. I don't see any objection in principle for a Conservative to make to state ownership of things. After all, the Royal Navy is state-owned and always has been, and it would be rather silly if it weren't, wouldn't it? So where's the principle involved? Nor am I against a welfare state. I'm very much in favour of the concept of the deserving poor. So some people really, really need to be helped. Some people need very much to be encouraged to help themselves. And I think a welfare system has to be designed that takes that into account, so that it's extremely generous to those who really need it and turns a pretty flinty face to those who don't.
Do you think we need free broadband from the government?
I'd never actually thought about it. It seems an odd thing to be provided free. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think I pay for mine.
I suppose it's not available free anywhere else. So I
don't know. I don't remember telephones being free when they were the main means of communication. Rather the opposite. They were a good deal more expensive.
It seemed a bit random.
It's interesting watching. I don't know whether you've been watching the trial of Christine Keeler on the television.
I have. I read your article about it.
It's interesting watching it, seeing how much the Christine Keeler's need to pay Stephen Ward for her expensive telephone calls comes up so often.
Yeah.
Phone calls were expensive in those days. People waited till after 6 in the evening to make them because the price dropped by half.
Oh, I didn't know that was the case.
After 6 and at weekends, that's the time to phone your friends, was the old GPO slogan on the telephone directories.
Are you enjoying the series?
Partly. Some of it irritates the pants off me, but some of it is it's compelling. I watch it without, it's not an effort to watch.
Sure. But what are your thoughts? Actually, that's an interesting segue into the BBC. Maybe we don't want to talk about that.
The BBC is a tragedy. The BBC is a great idea and should be a great institution and does decreasingly good things.
It's state-owned, so there's an element.
It's not really. It's a clever formula, the licence fee, which enables the state to provide it with facilities and money without having a direct hand in its governing, which is good. But again, it's a failure of conscience and a failure of self-control. The BBC's charter and agreement clearly oblige it, for instance, to be impartial on issues of controversy, and it simply, demonstrably isn't.
Is it possible to be?
Yeah.
I think that's
right. Well, it's certainly possible to do a good deal better job than they're doing at the moment.
I suppose the question is, I think people say that pretty much all media, all newspapers, when they're reporting, it's selective. And
of course, but you must remember that newspapers in the BBC are wholly different.
True.
Nobody is required to pay for their mail on Sunday.
I feel
people
required.
don't come around with detective vans to check that you paid for it, or prosecute you for not paying for it. Whereas they do with the BBC. People can if you don't like the Mail on Sunday's idea of what the world is like, then you can go and buy the Observer, can't you? So it doesn't, and the opposite is also true. Whereas with the BBC, that's it. It is there, and it's charter and agreement in return for having that money, in return for having the legal power to demand money for everybody who has a television set and watches it. It is supposed to be impartial. It can't operate like a newspaper, but it doesn't really try. There are a few people in the BBC. I do know people in the BBC who make an effort to do this, but they are weaker and weaker by the year, and a lot of them simply don't understand the nature of what it is that they do. For instance, ridiculously, I've even had it said to me that drama, for instance, is not as important an area for impartiality in political coverage, which is actually the opposite of the truth. Who remembers? There were dozens of radical documentaries about unmarried mothers and prisons and all the rest of it in the BBC of the 60s and Hugh Carlton. No one remembers any of them. What they remember is Cathy Come Home and Up the Junction. Drama has a far more lasting and powerful effect on the public mind. And yet when I complained about a plainly partial portrayal of the abortion question in Call the Midwife,
yes.
I couldn't get anywhere. It's drama. They said it's not subject to these rules. And anyway, whatever you say, we're going to do this whether you like it or not. I do, because it seems to me to be the job of the journalist to try and behave like a normal human being as much as possible. I do actually take formal official complaints to the BBC. I go through their procedure to find out what happens.
Really?
Oh yeah, right the way to this around.
I wonder how many
if you ever
people
want to
do
complain
that.
to the BBC, I can tell you how to do it. It's not. Well, no. The initial there's an initial sort of spongy barrier around the corporation, run by Capita, the famous service organisation or whatever it's called. And if you complain to the BBC on their website, the Capital will send you a reply saying, "Tough luck, Buster. Your complaint's been passed on. We're not interested."
Yeah.
You have to then complain about that complaint before your complaint gets past the spongy barrier and begins to penetrate the actual flesh of the BBC. And only when you get to a body called the Executive Complaints Unit have you actually reached a person.
And you're a regular?
I would say regular, but I possibly 2 or 3 times a year. I choose them carefully.
Okay. I saw your criticism of the Scrooge and the.
Well, I wouldn't complain. That wouldn't be enough of a complaint to the BBC because they hadn't breached their rules of impartiality. It was just bad, and it was artistically bad and artistically wrong, and it was as the dreadful Cumberbatch Sherlock Holmes series. What it did was it used an honoured and revered name of a great work of art or whatever it might be to promote something entirely different.
Sure.
It wasn't Scrooge. It was a different story.
Yeah.
But they grafted the name of Scrooge and some elements of A Christmas Carol onto it to get an audience at Christmas. I was pleased to see that most of it disappeared. I think most people couldn't stick it to the end. Well, especially once child abuse started getting involved, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
Almost every police drama now, the fundamental story is child abuse, isn't it?
Do you not think it's important? I suppose there's an interesting dichotomy there. It's interesting to reflect reality with art, and child abuse is something that's ubiquitous.
Well, I don't. Is it that because I don't know. It certainly seems to me to have become almost the only crime that lies at the root of almost any drama.
I suppose because it's considered so evil.
It's because of this idea, which is very common among left-wing people, that there's a vast establishment conspiracy to conceal child abuse among the powerful, which of course came out in the recent case of Field Marshal Brabble. All the rest of the police believe this stuff as well.
But there is some weight to it From what?
I'm not saying there isn't any child abuse.
No, but about the concealing of such, with the Rotherham scandals and Manchester.
That's totally different. What I'm saying here is there's a left-wing fantasy that the conservative establishment of judges, Tory politicians, and field marshals and all the rest of it are constantly abusing children, and this is being covered up.
Oh, I see. Yeah, no, I don't. There's not much evidence.
But the thing was that the police became totally beguiled by this fantasist, Carl Beech, who, in my view, has gone to prison for much too long.
Mm-hmm.
His sentence is ridiculously long because although he behaved very badly and lied his head off, he's actually a minor idiot. The people who still need to face some sort of disciplining are the people who believed him and who pursued this case and who publicly ruined the lives of people as they do it. And Harvey Proctor's experiences in this matter, Edwin Bramwell had the wherewithal to fight back. Lady Britain didn't, because her husband was dead by the time it was sorted out. Harvey Proctor is a man with no power standing, had his life pretty much devastated by this accusation. There really ought to be more comeback from that.
There is an interesting theme of because we live in such a hyper-connected society that now, just as a general point, accusations will destroy your life, whether they're true or not.
No, indeed. So the presumption of innocence is practically dead.
It is dead. It is, and that sort of comes back to the sort of.
This is why if we tumble, as I said earlier, if we tumble into a totalitarian hell, it'll be so easy.
Yeah.
People will be able to use the existing justice system to destroy the lives of people whose opinions they have.
And I think the sad thing is that it often the sort of, as you said, the decline and the decay of the presumption of innocence comes under the guise of being moral. When someone's accused of being a racist or having sex, it's always in the name of something good.
How else would you do it?
Yeah.
How else would you expect that to happen?
Yeah. Well, it's very effective.
It is effective. Yeah. As I say, the dismantling of proper juries and the abolition of unanimous verdicts is a total catastrophe.
Yeah.
Which again is dealt with in my book, The Abolition of Liberty, passed through with almost no opposition. A few judges and one or two people objected to it, just went through. And then the abolition of any kind of jury qualification. I mean, you can say that the property qualification had its faults, which it undoubtedly did, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have any limit at all. But as it stands, if you were accused of serious crime, the jury which tried you could be composed entirely of unemployed 18-year-olds.
Yeah. It's
now, is it possible that somebody of that age and that lack of experience could possibly have the wit, knowledge and understanding of the operation of the justice system, of the reliability or unreliability of evidence, to bring a true verdict according to law? And my answer is I very much doubt it. I don't see the English jury as much of a protection anymore. I just don't. It used to be, of course it was faulty, but it used to be a major protection against injustice. It isn't now. It hasn't been for a very long time, but most people simply aren't aware of that. People don't realise the significance of the majority verdict. And you've seen, or possibly not seen, the Henry Fonda film 12 Angry Men.
I know of it.
The great classic of the one man on the jury who stands out against the majority and says, no, the evidence is not good enough, this is not proven, and everyone's furious with him and keeps him in there, and eventually he wins them round. But under majority verdict, that couldn't happen.
He'd
be overridden. And the guy would go to jail wrongly because the jury hadn't considered it properly, and that, I think, is so much easier with majority verdict than it used to be.
It's an interesting direction. I suppose where I see it as well, there's the other element which is about your image in public, and how if you can lose your job over things like an allegation before ever having gone to court. That's a dangerous road as well. Your image is destroyed. No one will hire you again if you're.
No. It's terrifying.
Perhaps we should change subject. You seem. It's not a happy one.
What does this say? I mean, this is bad.
This is bad. Well, I tell you what. I wanted to ask you about Brexit, because I know that you're obviously someone who believes in us not being a part of the EU, but you also didn't vote in the referendum.
There were several different groups of people who wanted to leave the EU for wholly different reasons. I thought, and still do, that ultimately there was no good reason for Britain to be subject to the EU in terms of law and government. The arguments for economic links seem to me to be makeable. I think the damage that the EU has done to our economy, which it has done, is already done, and I don't think can be undone.
Mm.
The damage that will follow from leaving the single market and the customs union will be, I think, probably more considerable than most people realise, which is why I favoured the Norway option, which would have kept us in the single market and would not have been particularly distressed to see us in the customs union. The things I objected to were things like the European arrest warrant,
Okay.
basically destroyed habeas corpus. And this simple fact, in the European Union, almost all the members of the Union have one form or another of Roman law.
Mm.
They don't have common law. They don't have a true presumption of innocence. They have pre-trial detention as a normal feature of life. Ultimately, if you're in a union which is moving towards ever closer coordination, then ultimately the pressure will arise for the coordination of and unification of legal systems. And in that case, the one which is only practiced by 2 or maybe 3 of the nations of the European Union will not be the one that survives. And I thought that above all things, our legal system, based on Magna Carta, based on jury trial, based on the presumption of innocence, based on habeas corpus, based on all the huge accretions of liberty of the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, could not be sacrificed, and that if we stayed in the European Union, those things would go. That's what bothered me. I came to this view probably sometime in the late 1990s. So interestingly, someone has fished up a clip of me being interviewed by C-SPAN in Washington DC in 1994, in which I defended British membership of the European Union. I wasn't that surprised, because for most of my life of post-revolutionary politics, I'd been completely preoccupied with the Cold War. I saw the European Union as a minor issue, and I remember my old colleague on the Daily Express, George Gale, who was bitterly, furiously opposed to British membership of the European Union. I couldn't get it, because I thought, compared with the Soviet threat, it was nothing. And I must have come round to sort of general opposition in the late 1990s. And the attempt to get us into the single currency concentrated in my mind quite a lot. And then I think it was about 2004, I went to Norway, and I thought, this is a really good arrangement they have here.
Why didn't you vote for Brexit?
Well, I disapprove of referendum.
So that's just a principled stance, and if I remember correctly, you wanted the Conservative Party to split.
Well, see, what I wanted a revolution in this country, if you like, using the word revolution in the widest sense, in which the Conservative Party was sacrificed for the good of the nation.
Yes.
What we got and what the referendum enabled was the opposite. The country was sacrificed for the good of the Conservatives.
That's a superb analysis.
Well, it is mine. That's what happened. That's the whole point of the referendum, was to save the Conservative Party, just as Harold Wilson's 1975 referendum, in which I did vote, interestingly, to leave.
You voted to leave in the initial?
I did, but there was a particular reason for it. I hadn't really thought very much about it, but the provincial evening newspaper for which I worked had a very enthusiastic supporter of staying in the common market as a deputy editor. And the day before the vote, I stumbled across a story. I saw a leaflet was put through my front door, and it had listed all these notable people in Swindon, where I then worked, who were said to be in favour of staying in. I noticed one of them was a colleague of mine on the local paper. And 2 things were striking about it. One was that her name was misspelt in a very stupid way. And secondly, when I took it into the office gleefully to show her, she said, "Good Lord, I never gave him any permission to do this." So I then rang around all the others, and most of the others said, that the thing was a fraud. And I thought this was a jolly good story.
Yeah.
And I wrote it.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was spiked by this deputy editor. So I, in protest at this behaviour, I went out and voted to leave. I'd previously going to vote to stay. I thought, if that's the way these people behave, then I would. So I was saved from voting the wrong way by events. That's what happened. I was furious. They published a story the next day after the polls had closed.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Actually, do you mind if we move the microphone a little bit closer to you? Just
really like
just a little bit. I don't want to intrude your space, but there we go. Okay, so that's it. So, do you not feel slightly more positive about the direction of the Conservative Party today? Not at all.
Why would I?
Boris, this sort of Disraeli essence to him. You don't feel that?
Quite. So what's so good about that? I mean, these people are not conservatives.
I suppose, one nation conservatism isn't quite your thing, is it?
Whatever that means.
Yeah, it's ill-defined.
It's political opposition. The Conservative Party, people say, well, when was the Conservative Party last Conservative? I said, well, I don't know. Never, as far as I know. It's always been a very successful organisation for retaining office for the Sons of Gentlemen. And it is, and it would, as I repeatedly say, it would cheerfully guillotine the Queen in Trafalgar Square if it thought that it would keep it in office. It has no principles. And Al Johnson, he's not a Conservative. Imagine, even 10 years ago, imagine a Prime Minister leaving his wife, or being dumped by his wife, and moving his girlfriend into Downing Street. Imagine the scenes. I mean, if anybody had done it. Yeah. And that's normal. But who is the first Prime Minister actually to live openly with a woman to whom he's not married in Downing Street? It's a supposedly Conservative Prime Minister. Well, you may approve, disapprove, or not care, but what you cannot say is that is a Conservative action.
Do you So you think divorce is just you're morally against divorce?
Oh yeah. And
really?
The Christian position is absolutely, it's clear words of Christ himself. Marriage is for life, and that's the Church of England's official position. The Church of England's actual marriage service is quite plain: so long as you both shall live, till death do you part.
So you don't sympathise with Henry VIII?
Henry VIII was never divorced.
He wasn't actually. That's true.
It was an annulment.
Yeah.
That he sought and got. And
are you in favour of annulment being allowed?
I could see the political arguments for it. I mean, I think a lot of the Protestants of the time were very opposed to his case for annulment. And in terms of precedent in the Roman Catholic Church, I can't see how his case was any worse than that of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And there was political denial of his annulment, and if you look down the ages at the Roman Catholic Church, I can't see how his case was any less political than that of Senator Edward Kennedy, who got an annulment as well. It's obviously a regrettable thing, but there were reasons of state, and if you look at what happened to England, what he was frantically trying to do was to ensure a male heir. If you look at what happened to England after the death of Elizabeth, when there was no male heir, because Elizabeth would not marry because she knew that by marrying she would bring a king into the country, and her sister Mary brought Philip II of Spain into the country as her husband. Remember that his failure to beget a male heir gave us the Stuarts. Yeah, well, they were a success. So you can see what he was worried about.
Yeah.
Sure. But it was a matter of raison d'etat. But the point remains that the Church of England, officially, although it's gone soggy about this in its back rooms, officially the Church of England's doctrine is that marriage is for life.
Do you think that should be imposed by law?
Well, there is civil divorce.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we aren't.
But the church doesn't recognise it. You shouldn't. Until very recently, the church would not remarry a divorced person while their spouse was living. There's a difficulty that Prince Charles is in.
Yes, that is certainly true. I just wanted to move on a little bit from. We sort of digressed a little bit, but I find
you can't help it.
Well, it is a podcast, so that's sort of what we're here for.
Very long podcast, if we're not careful.
Please, tell me whenever
Well, I think we should, let's break at noon, shall we? I think otherwise we'll go on all day.
Break at noon? Okay.
Yeah. So
in which
you've got
case...
time to get in whatever you really want
yes.
to. I think...
Let me think here.
My voice will give that.
There's so many things I wanted to talk about. We've got Soleimani, drugs, multiculturalism.
We'll just get on with it, eh? And then
multiculturalism. I've heard you say you're not in favour of multiculturalism. You're in favour of integration. Yeah. Are they completely incompatible?
They're totally incompatible. They are the opposites. Again, when I was living here in the 1960s, what we were against, let's say, was what we call racialism.
Yes.
I remember when I was down at what was then called the Cowley Road Tech, the College of Further Education, there was a hairdresser's on the Cowley Road which was accused of discriminating against black customers. Mm-hmm. And we got up a great picket against it, which turned into a huge demonstration. I think it was the first anti-racialist demonstration in Britain at the time. It may well have been, certainly became a big issue. And what we thought at the time was one race, the human race, and what we believed in at the time, which I still believe in, is that if you want to have a harmonious society, then you integrate.
Yes.
People are all fundamentally the same. You by not discriminating, by treating everybody equally, then you attain harmony. But that obviously involves the integration of the migrant into the host country, because the host country has the culture into which people can most successfully integrate. And there are many instances of this happening. Mm-hmm. And suddenly, at some point, the idea took root that instead we would go for multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. And what multiculturalism does is it says that people should remain different. Yes. I'm not saying integration doesn't mean people should be forced to give up every aspect of their previous culture. Mm-hmm. It just means that in the widest and in the public sphere, they make an effort to learn the language, the laws, and to become, insofar as it's possible, as English or as British as they can. Yeah. But what we did with multiculturalism was we encouraged the creation of solitudes. Yeah. With their backs turned upon each other. The most worrying example of which is to be found in Bradford, where it's not particularly unharmonious at the moment, but the fact is that the Muslim population, largely Kashmiri in origin of Bradford, will share the city centre and the buses and the shops and the cinemas with the what you might call the non-Muslim population. But the rest of the time, they live entirely separate lives, like the French Canadians and the Anglo Canadians. So their backs turned to the two solitudes, and I don't think this works. Is it so much? And also, in many cases, in people's homes, the English is not spoken. Yes, but is it so much that was encouraged by the government, or was that just allowed to happen? I'm not sure. It's a tough one. I'm not sure, because there is doubtless a history of it to be written, but I don't know who is going to write it, or which part of the academy is going to encourage anybody to do it or publish the resulting book, because it's not a popular thought. No. But it plainly did happen, and plainly some people wanted it to happen. I think the row over Ray Honeyford's essay in the Salisbury Review, which again came up in Roger Scruton's obituaries, is an interesting reflection on what happened to somebody who raised, I think, legitimate concerns about it at the time it was going on. Yeah. Well, I'm sure I imagine you've probably been called a racist before. Well, I get called a racist about 3 times a day, but as I know that it isn't true. It doesn't concern you? Well, it doesn't concern me. I simply say to people, if they do it, and if they're trivial people, then one lets it go. I did on one occasion, when it was associated with a major organisation. I took legal action and got not to get money, but to get an apology and a retraction. But that was because it was a major organisation, and it took about 2 days. Okay. So I will do it when necessary, but I try. Journalists do try very hard not to sue. Yeah. And if trivial people say it, then it's trivial, isn't it? And you can't quite bother. But no, I know it's not. It is. There's a wonderful passage in the Simon Raven Arms for Oblivion series, very good books, and wonderful Places Where They Sing, about the student revolts of the 60s, and the dons at fictional Cambridge College are arguing about the left. And one says, well, they go on about this and the other, and another of the dons, who's a crusty old conservative, says the hatred of these left-wing students for racial bigotry is the best thing about them.
It's an interesting point, actually.
True. Is.
It's interesting, the word racialism and racism.
Well, they're different. Racialism is actually clearly about racial discrimination. Racism elides, and actually it becomes about cultural discrimination, which in my view is not only different, but in many ways it's opposite.
Mm.
It's a lost battle, but I fight lost battles. It's my function in life. All forgotten.
You've given up
things and battles long ago. Well, I've given up in any attempts to influence matters, but that's partly because I'm a great enthusiast for Alistair Looking Glass, in which once she's through the looking glass, what she realises is to obtain any of her objects, she often has to do the opposite of what you would normally do.
Indeed.
If you want to reach the garden, you walk away from it.
I suppose you
have to do all the running you can do to stay in the same place. People don't read the Alice books anymore, but they are actually full of philosophy.
Yeah, it's true.
And also, the Alice was a real person and lived here, and that also has big influence on me.
Lived here?
She lived. Alice was the daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, Alice Little.
Oh, I did not know that.
Oh, well, and in the original version of Alice in Wonderland, there's a postscript in which he makes it plain that this is set in Oxford.
Yes, I think that does ring a bell.
There's a thing I wrote for an American magazine called First Things about Oxford, in which this is discussed. I'm sure I recommend you. Okay. I recommend it to anybody.
I'll have to take a look. But just back on that multiculturalism, because there's an interesting point about how, as you were talking about being an anti-racialist, am I correct in saying that the pursuit was to be colourblind?
Yes. But that's one of the reasons why, when you see in the McPherson report, the denunciation of colourblind policing is so disturbing.
Yes.
Because colourblind policing is precisely what I would want to see.
Absolutely. Nobody
arrested for driving while black.
Yeah. But I suppose now, a lot, and you could relate this back to what we were talking about with wokeness, which is where people want to sort of, rather than being colourblind, it's almost becoming an obsession with sort of collective identities, with whether it's race or religion or whatever it might be. People want to not be colourblind, but actually celebrate them overtly. I don't know if that resonates with you at all.
I don't. It's not. It's another world from mine.
But I suppose people don't
let people do as they wish.
People will say, as a white man, as the three of us are.
Pinko Grey, I think, was E.M. Forster's more accurate.
But we're in a position of privilege to be colourblind.
Okay, so.
I agree with that. But
next? As Clement Attlee used to say. Next question.
But I suppose what I'm getting at is that I'm sort of speaking on behalf of someone else here, whoever it might be, is that being colourblind is to be ignorant to someone's personal experiences.
Maybe it is, but what would you prefer?
Yeah.
Would you prefer a sort of South African gradation of all kinds of everyone being classified and treated according to the colour of their skin, for goodness sake?
Mm. But
what a point at which to classify people.
Yeah.
And what the Martin Luther King speech, judged by the contents of our characters, not by the colour of our skin. It's so obvious. He said it.
Yeah.
He should have known. No one could claim he didn't know what it was like to be at the wrong end of racial discrimination.
Yeah. It does seem like we've lost sight of that a little bit.
Totally.
Yeah. It's I suppose we are approaching noon, so.
Yeah. Well, you've got, by my calculation, you've got 7 minutes.
7 minutes. I've got 8 minutes here.
Okay. Well, your watch is wrong.
Why was it wrong to kill Soleimani?
It was outside the laws of war, and you cannot. there are rules under which you can kill people in their seconds when you can establish that they are about to commit some terrible crime, but I don't think this has been established. If the United States government can show us that they prevented some particular imminent crime by doing so, then they might be able to justify it. Otherwise, it was just an assassination. I forget the actual terms of the Geneva Conventions, which prevent this, but unless you're actually on a battlefield, which he wasn't, you can't just kill people.
Sure.
You can, but you're not supposed to. And we're supposed to be, society is governed by laws, both internally and externally. If we're not, then almost all the actions that we take are pretty much illegitimate anyway. So, and we're living in anarchy. And here is the thing: if when China develops Reaper drones and decides that it's going to start killing prominent generals or security officials in countries it doesn't like, what will our locus standi be if we want to complain about it? I promise you the Chinese Foreign Ministry is taking note of all these things constantly, all the things that we do when we excuse ourselves for doing, and the time will come when China wants to really flex its muscles, when it will do them too, and when we complain, it will say, but we're only doing what you did. We're licensing China. Most of all, and this is my fear, when China becomes a true superpower, we're licensing China to do all the things we now do. Do you want that to happen? If you don't do it. Apart from any other leaving aside all the issues of policy and of what an intelligent policy towards Iran would be, certainly not the one we're now following.
I suppose the argument is that Soleimani, being essentially the organizer of Hezbollah, Shia militias in Syria, in Iraq, Houthi rebels in Yemen, and Hamas in Gaza, there are imminent instances of violence coming from all of those groups. So taking him out, I don't know if you could really say that they prevented it, but it may have...
Well, then I think they've stopped even bothering to pretend that, as far as I know.
It is a tough one, I think.
Anyway, we wouldn't prevent it, because it's not as if the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps doesn't have other people to step into his shoes.
Yeah.
It's a big organisation.
Do you think it was wrong?
It runs a bank. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
No, it's a state within a state. The IRGC is a tremendously fascinating and important body, but they have the bank as well.
There's
nothing they don't do.
The thing I didn't like about the way that a lot of Soleimani's death was framed, because you had about 1 million people showing up to his funeral, but it's almost as if people forgot that just a year ago Iran was in meltdown with riots against the government. The younger generation.
Iran is a complicated and fascinating society, which I've had the great privilege of visiting, and it's not a simple place.
Absolutely not.
And both of those things could equally well be true.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of the people.
Quite honestly, if the Americans assassinated the Chief of Staff of the British Army, I think quite a lot of people of a Labour persuasion, and quite left-wing people in this country, would go on the streets to protest against it, because a foreigner had come and killed one of ours. Whether he was one of ours we particularly liked, I don't know, but there would be a resentment of it and an anger about it.
Sure.
Because people don't like foreigners interfering violently in their countries, do they?
I suppose if that general was a leader of multiple militias around the world, leading terrorism...
If you must understand that all the actions of any country can be presented by a skillful propagandist in such a light as to suggest that you are the progenitor of evil. And a lot of people actually don't like Britain very much.
That's true.
A lot of them are in Iran. The view of Iran in Britain is of an untrustworthy, interfering, duplicitous country. And it's not wholly unjustified. And the Member of Parliament for Oxford in my teens was a man called Monty Woodhouse. You come across him?
Rings a bell.
He was a Conservative member. He was re-elected after a gap in 1970, I remember the night. And Monty Woodhouse's main achievement had been, along with Kermit Roosevelt, in 1953, to organise a putsch against the, as far as I can recall, democratically elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. Bribing mobs, bribing generals, violently overthrowing a legitimate government.
Which year was this?
1953.
So then the Shah was reinstated.
All the details of it are on the internet. The whole thing. The papers were released. It's not. No one even bothers to deny it anymore. It was a joint CIA MI6 operation to overthrow the government of Iran. basically because they wanted to have revenues from
oil
that we wanted to have.
And that's when the Shah was reinstated.
That's when the Shah was reinstated. And this is the leaving aside the pretty much partition of Iran between Britain and Russia, which had existed since the 19th century, and interference which we had consistently in that country. They don't like us. It's not personal. If you go there, people will be very, very charming to you. I've had many very pleasant conversations with individual Iranians, but as a country, they regard us as violent, duplicitous, and interfering. And actually, they have reason to do so.
The sense that I get is that Iran actually is, I don't want to say Western, sorry, I will make this...
Well, this is your time.
This is the last point. But Iran is, because I think there's the history of a slightly more modern existence in Iran, more freedoms, in some regards at least, because although under the Shah it was autocratic, there were certain freedoms.
People were tortured. I remember in the 1970s in Broad Street, there used permanently to be people asking you to sign petitions against torture in Iran. And I never signed. I said, it's all very well you saying that. I said, but when you lot get into power, you'll be torturing people too. And they smiled wanly and passed on to somebody else. But it was not exactly Liberal Democrats under the Shah of Shahs.
It's hard to compare the current regime with the Shah, though.
What can I say? And one thing says this is the ridiculous absolutes of evil countries and all the rest of it, which we try to use. We're always good, they're always bad. That's never true. You should learn to be a bit more modest.
I do agree with that, but I suppose that narrative, and I'm not saying you particularly, but that narrative, if you look at someone like George Galloway, for example, it can feed into such anti-Western rhetoric
but George is an old... my main differences with George have always been over Castro and the Soviet Union. That's what George is.
But do you not see how his sort of rhetoric can almost, if someone's listening to that... I disagree
with him. I think that it's I'm not making the same case as him. My view is that conservative people should understand these issues and take possession of them and not leave it to people such as George to be the only voices of dissent on this matter.
That I do agree with.
I think I'm sick and tired of it, of conservative-minded people being sucked in by the crudest propaganda and having no subtlety in their approaches either to domestic or to foreign policy. It's not always United versus City. We haven't always been right. They haven't always been wrong, and other countries will continue to exist. We no longer try to make the whole world English. We accept that it was a policy objective. We no longer seek to do it.
Yeah.
The world will not be that way. There will be other countries where people do things differently. The rest of the world is a foreign country. They do things differently there, as one might say. They and accept it. Within their borders, they have their business. They have their own histories. They have their own concerns. This particularly, I feel, about Russia. The ridiculous inability of people to understand that it exists. And it exists, and here is this is the simple story I tell about Russia, and this I'll finish after this because it's so important.
Yes.
People make jokes about other people's languages. The best one was the one that Shirley Williams, she made it up, it isn't true, I wish it was, and she claimed that George W. Bush had said that the French had no word for entrepreneur.
That wasn't true?
No, Shirley Williams, as far as I can tell, made it up, and it's a very good joke.
I always thought that was true.
So you have to be careful what you say about other people's languages, but I will tell you, I know a bit of Russian. I'm not a great Russian speaker, but I've checked this with my friends who are Russians. And the word for the principal word, because Russian has lots of synonyms like English, but the principal and most used word for safety and or security in Russian is bezopasnost.
Okay.
I know we speak any Russian.
I don't.
Okay, well the point about bezopasnost is that it begins with the word bez, which means without.
Okay.
It's a compound word, and bezopasnost means without danger. In Russia, the word for safety or security is a negative word. The default position in Russia is danger.
Wow.
This is a country which has no physical borders to speak of, no great mountains, no impassable deserts, no shores and seas. It's just a landmass which can be and is invaded by other people on an almost regular basis. Its second city was, 70 years ago, under a siege in which hundreds of thousands of people starved to death because of the most recent invasion. The half the country is still recovering from the most tremendous war damage.
Mm-hmm.
They have a different view from a country which has the great good fortune to be surrounded by deep salt water. And we have always to remember that. And we go on about the Battle of Britain and the finest hour and Churchill's speeches and all the rest of it. What ultimately saved us from subjugation in 1940 was the sea. They haven't got it.
There's a bit of luck involved.
We have,
for sure.
and we should be a bit more sensitive to that in other countries as well. But I've been fantastically lucky. I've travelled, I think, to 57 countries.
Wow.
And I make use of this experience and tell you the world is not as simple as you think it is. There is good and there is evil, but there are many areas in between, and you have to learn. And one of the things you have to learn is that other people's countries are their own business, not yours. Stop messing around with them.
Well, I think on that note, we will let you go. But there's one last question that I think you can answer. I'll make it very brief. Your advice to young people is to leave the country.
Yeah.
Where should we go?
Well, if you can't work it out for yourself, then you won't make it.
Mr. Hitchens, hopefully one day we can talk some more. But thank you so much.
Abroad.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to meet you.
Thank you.